I'm sure you know this feature.
Spider-Man into the Spider-Verse.
And for a very good reason. Into the Spider-Verse is a really pivotal animated feature, and not just because it managed to deliver a deep personal story, all the while continuing to erase racial boundaries and stereotypes, embracing cultures both old and new. But it also managed to shatter long-held traditions in CG animation with a beautiful and unique style. What I've always wanted to do with animation is to study people who look at other ways to approach animation. And to be honest, right now, there's no greater triumph than Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. As Ralph Bakshi said,
animation is both technique and story together. That's why I love animation. In other words, you have to find a style that tells you a story with impact.
it's always good to have a reference point, and Spider-Verse pulled from what it knew.
There is no better medium for honoring where the comics first came from, which is a printed comic.
Now, I'm not going to just talk about the Spider-Verse today, but rather what I think are important trends that are forging a fresh trajectory for animation.
Glitching? No. Why would you even say that?
These experiments are important because they fight for the idea of what animation is, bringing people together to share experiences.
We had talented people from all over the world working together on this movie that kind of echoed what you see in the movie is people coming from whole different universes to get together and realize their commonalities.
And they all had a unique, focused goal, which was to break the machine.
I think in this instance, the machine is the industry, and Into the Spider-Verse proved that there is an appetite and an audience for artistically driven animated features. It really helped to open the door for voices ready to just charge in. So let's have a look at some of the limitations of different mediums and see how they were advanced. Let's start with CG. One of the biggest limitations with CG is the mesh. The placement of polygons over a surface that will need to survive not only subdivision without overlapping and creating artifacts, but also be tactile enough to stretch and move to the animator's wish. Now, with better computers and software, what machines can handle has gotten a lot better. But what I'd really like to press home here is that the 3D shape eventually will hit a limitation and get a little wild. It's part of the reason why Toy Story had plastic toys as its main characters.
You're welcome.
In traditional animation, the only limitation is your imagination. So it's easier to work with strong caricatured shapes rather than trying to dive toward reality. Although it's really getting close. Other limitations the medium has is that most of the software and studio pipelines are built to work with sequential images a second. So just bear with me here for a second. If the frame rate is set to 24 frames per second, new images are generated 24 times a second. We call these ones. If you were animating on ones, you'd have one new drawing 24 times a second. Now, with CG, you have a wonderfully expressive camera that rotates in space, capturing the full three-dimensionality, but that camera records on ones. Now, traditional animation works on twos, which is a new image every second frame, so it would be 12 images a second. Now here's where it gets tricky because the camera needs to animate on ones, and if you want the characters to animate on twos and you set the camera to the same rhythm, it would seem choppy and disorientating. It really needs to stay in ones. In Spider-Verse, they embraced it as an artistic choice.
It seems so simple, like let's do half the work, but really it meant like let's do 4 times the work because everything else in the whole pipeline was set up for a new image every frame, like simulations and camera and all of that stuff. So we had to really task our amazing crew with trying to figure out how to make it work, and it was not easy.
Peter moves on ones when he's in control and more fluid, and Miles slowly moves from twos to ones and gets in sync with him over the feature. Penny actually was animated on 3s and 4s, just to distinguish her style further from the group. It's a really little subliminal thing, and it really works.
Your brain makes perfect in between.
Yeah.
Like, and what
like not having to worry about making perfect arcs and perfect splines and all that stuff made it so that the whole team could spend more time doing these other things.
Yeah, but then the whole process of pushing that down the pipe was another story.
Also in CG, if you wanted to show fast movement to sell that speed, usually the motion is blurred. Unlike 2D animation, where they will literally add a smear or a zip frame to sell fast movement. It was actually something the animators in Sony Animation had looked at before with Genndy Tartakovsky on Hotel Transylvania. His style of strong posing really needed to push the medium forward and led them to develop a new blurring technology that held the poses in between. They actually called it the Genndy blur. Now in Spider-Verse, they developed techniques to literally smear the character or draw lines to sell impacts. They also used multiples where they would literally insert extra legs, arms, hands, eyes, even whole bodies just to sell movement as it flashes across our eye. Recently in a feature like The Willoughbys, you can actually see similar techniques to the Genndy blur. They wanted the visual language of the film to feel more like stop motion, so they used a variable frame exposure, being very selective in what information the audience received. Even in the movement, their philosophy was less is more.
Less is more doesn't mean you're just giving the audience less. It's more about being precise, knowing what you want to show. Like with variable frame exposure again, if you say you're animating with a mixture of 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, you might be at some time giving them less images per second, but it never came at the cost of less information.
Now, of course, there are incredible strengths to CG animation, which has led it to kind of dominate the landscape at the moment. Part of it being the expressionality of the camera, using focal lengths, depth of field, exposure, getting into true cinematography. The camera can almost go anywhere and you can have it do anything. But the biggest strength is definitely when it comes to the shading process, using volumetric lights and various textures to sell realism. I mean, everything you put in a scene is then affected by the same light. So the process is very similar to just setting up lights on a real set. In that sense, it's a lot easier to make convincing objects and landscapes, but characters are still coming along. But the best thing about this are the stylistic choices that can come with that. I mean, do you want lots of fur and hair, which is a nightmare to render, or just make it chunky, give the illusion of hair and put the focus elsewhere? To get a specific style, maybe a more painterly feel, you need to treat that in later steps or start with a more traditional method. Let's have a look at traditional or 2D animation. The strongest part of traditional animation is definitely the wealth of character animation from years and years of development. The study of caricature, the study of movement, the layers of details that are just captivating. I know a lot of people who swoon over the artistry in traditional animation, and for a very good reason. But CG doesn't generally get the same attention. But I will say again, it is definitely catching up. I mean, just look at this. Traditional animation also offers a closer bridge to different artistic styles. The work of the line, what sits in between where the shapes form, it's a powerful tool in animation. So again in Spider-Verse, drawing from comics, they wanted to introduce that expressive line.
The big idea was like, how do we get the artist's hand onto the screen, right? How can we, so that's why it's a combination of like CGI technology and just people painting things.
Now, it's not the first time 2D lines have been mixed into 3D work.
There were such phenomenal drawings being done of all the characters, and it seemed like, why do we have to leave these drawings behind? Isn't there a way that we can get these drawings to move on top of the CG? Can't we get the CG to carry those drawings along with them?
So similar to Paperman, vector lines were added to the top of the characters. My favorite are the eyes. Each one is so unique with a calculated roughness to them. And again, drawing from comic book design, we see these burst cards highlighting and enhancing strong moments.
It was a mission statement of the show, or like a theory. We didn't care whether it was technically accurate if it looked better.
Now, one of the biggest limitations of traditional animation comes in the form of lighting. Unlike CG, where you can just drop a light in and all the surfaces react, usually what we see in traditional animation are these relatively flat characters, kind of like stickers over a beautiful background, and often with minimal integration. Maybe they might have a shadow pass, but usually to achieve the level of realistic lighting, it takes a lot of work that just isn't built into the pipeline. Well, then there's Klaus.
If the traditional animation look of flat colors with color lines was an artistic choice, then why would companies feel the need to airbrush DVD covers? Clearly that was not a choice, that was a limitation.
Sergio Pablos wanted the expressive nature of traditional animation. It just leaps off the page, but also for it to appear like the concept paintings. He was inspired by reflection and how they applied a painted look over 3D models. So along with Les Films de Poisson Rouge, they developed lighting and texturing software that gave the artists control over where to use color, as if they were painting with light. It also allowed them to create texture passes, which changed the traditional animation from this to this. I mean, it's really incredible what they achieved. I know a lot of people talk about Spider-Verse, and I am as well, but I think Klaus has grabbed the potential of animation and dragged it forward to say, hey, it doesn't have to look like this. We can do this as well.
There's all those styles in these books that I was telling you about, that any of them should be a viable style that you should be able to put on the screen directly. Why jeopardize something that looks this great, you know? But hopefully we've opened the possibilities to the same as the many artistic possibilities an artist could choose from. And that's the hope.
Of course there's 3D elements in Klaus as well. It's not all traditional methods, but here's the beauty of the art form. Both CG and traditional are just mediums to help tell a story. Now that they are beginning to beautifully blend, each covering the other's limitations, films like J'ai perdu mon corps are continuing to blur the line of what each technique can offer. And it draws from what it needs just to tell the story, blending the methods seamlessly.
Your film did that very well, and it opened the door. Sometimes the door is getting closed again each year, and another film is opening the door. After my film, maybe the door will close. I don't want this. And so our duty is to keep the door open.
I think the thing we're all hoping is that there's another leap forward, you know, from what was done here, that there's got to be, you know, you're talking about, this turned out to be the perfect way to tell Miles' story in his, you know, his environment, his home, his world. Hopefully with other characters, there's going to be something about their stories that lends itself to, you know, another cool, like, as yet unforeseen way to use the medium to be super expressive and really specific.
Like I said at the beginning, Spider-Verse is incredible for all the technical work brought about to fulfill its artistic design. But just as importantly, it proved there is an audience ready to watch work outside the industry's limitations.
There is no boundaries for animation. I mean, the only boundaries we have is the industry who will put the boundaries.
Now don't get me wrong, what we see with Disney or DreamWorks or Pixar is beautiful, but it's not the only way to share experiences. With all the innovation coming through animation at the moment, I really genuinely hope and believe we're at a turning point in animation. Or at least the doors are opening for filmmakers to approach telling the stories whatever way they want through animation. And we can understand that it's not just locked into these specific conventions.
Josh Beveridge, in a couple of interviews, he said something that I love, which is he realized after this that in art, if you're scared, it means you're doing something valuable, you know, and different, and you're pushing at least your own personal boundaries. You know, you can't really get better if you're not doing something that challenges you.
I really love that idea too. To push art forward, we have to push ourselves forward first. It's a leap of faith. That's all it is. Thank you you so much for watching, as always. Your continued support is amazing. But a special shout out, of course, goes to my Patreons. These people are the heroes that continuously support this channel. If you want to get involved, of course, there's a link in the description below. Thanks for watching.